There is material that you can literally grow in a few days at home, and it usually takes about 5 days. It does not require factories, oil, or complex chemistry, because it is not created by industry, but by biology itself. But in terms of its properties, it is a completely different material, and it has almost nothing in common with ordinary polystyrene foam. This material does not melt into a toxic mass at high temperatures, does not emit toxins, and simply decomposes over time. And in about a month and a half, it can completely turn into ordinary soil. In fact, this is still the same organic matter that it originally consists of, it just turns into a full-fledged material. There's nothing synthetic in it, and it does not leave behind any debris that will remain for decades. And at the same time, this is no longer something experimental. Large companies are already using it, including IKEA, which uses it to package and deliver furniture to dozens of countries. And NASA is considering it as an option for construction outside of Earth. This is not an idea for the future, but a real thing that is used and has long been tested in practice. There are already production facilities, finished products, and the entire scientific base has long been collected, but almost no one uses it in everyday life. Then the question arises, why is a material that is cheaper, safer, and simpler not still used everywhere? And quite quickly it becomes clear that the issue is not technology, but who decides which materials are given a chance to appear in our world. In 2007, an engineering student from New York State did a rather strange thing, and not in the laboratory, but right in his dorm room. His name was Iban Bayer, and at some point he decided not to produce the material, but to grow it. We were talking about material based on mycelium, that is, mycelium. At the time, it almost sounded like an experiment because no one was seriously considering mushrooms as a base for packaging or building blocks. He took common agricultural waste, like corn residue, sawdust, and plant fibers, and added mycelium to it, then simply left the mixture to grow in the mold. The mycelium literally grows through all this, binds the particles together, and gradually turns the loose mass into a dense, solid material. It is not assembled or glued from the outside, but is formed from the inside, because the mycelium itself works as a natural frame and holds everything together. Mycelium is not something rare or artificial, but a vast underground network that has existed on the planet for hundreds of millions of years and plays a key role in how soil and ecosystems work. That is why this experiment turned out to be so unusual, because it did not invent anything new, but simply took an already existing natural mechanism and used it where no one had used it before. We are no longer talking about one technology, but about an attempt to replace an entire industry that has shaped what surrounds us for decades. And all this is about polystyrene, the plastic from which foam and most packaging are made. Its history began back in the 19th century, and already in the 1930s, production became widespread. And since then, this material has gradually taken its place almost everywhere, from household items to construction and electronics. But there is another side to all this, because polystyrene almost does not decompose naturally, which means everything that is thrown away today remains in the environment for tens and even hundreds of years, gradually accumulating. Over time, it does not disappear but breaks down into smaller and smaller particles, turning into microplastic, which is found not only in the soil and oceans, but also inside living organisms. Against this background, the difference with mycelium-based materials becomes obvious because they behave completely differently. Such materials are grown on common agricultural waste, such as sawdust or straw, and then within a few weeks can completely decompose in a regular compost medium and simply return to the soil. Moreover, during growth, the mycelium not only forms the structure of the material, but also absorbs carbon, which makes it less harmful compared to synthetic plastics. It is also important that the production of such materials requires significantly less energy and resources, because agricultural waste is used as a basis, which would otherwise have to be disposed of. Even at high temperatures, this difference remains, because polystyrene melts and can release toxic substances, and the mycelium simply chars and does not turn into a dangerous mass. And all this is already being used in practice, and companies like Regenerative Design have long been bringing such materials to the market as a full-fledged alternative. which, due to its properties, is suitable for protecting cargo, can withstand loads, and can be used in packaging. Large brands paid attention to this back in the last decade, and by the middle of 2010s, the first projects began to appear in which mycelium packaging was used instead of polystyrene, including to protect sensitive equipment during transportation. However, the possibilities of such materials are not limited only to packaging, because architects and designers are beginning to use them in construction, furniture, and even in the fashion industry, where mycelium is considered as a replacement for leather and other synthetic materials. And all this is not happening somewhere in the future, but right now, because the technologies are already working, production exists, and such materials are gradually beginning to replace the usual plastic. By 2011, Dell began shipping its servers in mycelium packaging to protect tens of thousands of dollars worth of equipment and survive shipping without damage. And in 2014, a tower about 40 feet high, assembled entirely from mycelium blocks, was exhibited at the Museum of Modern Art. This was one of the first attempts to use such materials in architecture. By 2020, IKEA announced plans to completely replace polystyrene packaging throughout its entire supply chain, using mycelium as one of the main materials. Such materials have long gone beyond the laboratory and individual experiments, because they are used in tasks where strength, predictability, and scale are important. In June 2024, NASA awarded a grant of about $2 million for a project related to the growing of structures from mycelium. The work is carried out at a research center in Silicon Valley. The project seems simple in formulation but unusual in essence, because the goal is not to deliver ready-made structures, but to create residential modules directly on the Moon and Mars due to the growth of mycelium. Instead of transporting heavy elements through space, only the basic biomaterial is delivered, which is activated and begins to form the desired structure. This approach makes it possible to significantly reduce the mass of the cargo and use local resources, including lunar and Martian regolith, as part of future structures. Mycelium-based materials already show properties that are important for extreme conditions. They provide thermal insulation, partially shield radiation due to their structure, and can be restored in case of certain damage. These qualities make the design not just an experiment, but a viable option for future missions where every detail of the design matters. This is a direct result of how building materials are even allowed to exist in the United States of America. What is important here is not only what the material is made of and what properties it has, but whether it has gone through a system without which it is simply not allowed for use. In order for a material to be used in residential construction, it must comply with the standards of ASTM International, an organization that essentially decides what houses can be built from and what cannot be used. And it is through these standards that everything that is then considered the norm is formed. At the same time, standards for expanded polystyrene have existed since 1958, and during all this time, a whole system has gradually been built around it. Tests were made for it, the market was guided by its properties, construction standards were written taking it into account, and at some point it simply became a standard. But with mycelium, everything is different, because it does not have the same document base, because materials based on it do not have ASTM International certification, which means they simply do not pass through this system, even if their properties are suitable. As a result, without these standards, the material is simply not allowed further, permits are not issued, projects are not tested, and therefore even cheaper and safer solutions do not reach actual use. And polystyrene holds up not because of science and not because there are no alternatives, but because of documents, because they are the ones who set the rules by which something can be used in general, and such rules do not appear on their own. They are formed by those who have been working with plastic for a long time, and one of the key roles here is played by the American Chemistry Council, an association that includes Dow, DuPont, ExxonMobil, and Chevron, and all of them are interested in ensuring that the system does not change much. This is evident in the money because from 2020 to 2021 alone, the plastics industry and related organizations spent almost $200 million to stop laws against plastic. And here it is no longer a matter of technology, but of keeping things the way they are. In the state of New York in 2024, the situation repeated itself because the same American Chemistry Council spent about $930,000 fighting a bill that would have required companies to pay for the disposal of their plastic waste. But such measures immediately create demand for alternatives, including mycelium. But the law did not pass, and this shows well how everything works. Because new materials begin to be used not when they are already ready, but when they are given permission to do so. A similar situation was in other countries because back in 1999, China tried to abandon polystyrene foam containers. And since then, such attempts appear from time to time in different places. But almost always, everything ends the same. And in the end, the choice of materials depends not only on their properties, but on who sets the rules. Because it is through them that they decide what will be used and what will remain aside, even if it has long been ready to replace familiar things. By 2014, solutions began to appear that were no longer tied to factories and production lines, because the material could be obtained directly under normal conditions, without complex infrastructure and large investments. And the approach itself gradually changed because the material no longer needs to be first produced somewhere separately and then transported, because it can appear immediately on the spot from what is already at hand. The basis is taken from ordinary agricultural waste, such as straw, husks, or sawdust, which previously simply remained superfluous, but here they become part of the material. But the entire industry is based on production, transportation, and supplies, and without this, it simply does not work. But in this case, the very need for such a system begins to disappear. The process itself works differently because the mycelium grows through the base and gradually binds it into a dense structure, due to which the material is solid throughout the entire volume. And at the same time, it remains light and has good thermal insulation properties. And because it's all made from the same waste, production actually goes back to where the raw materials come from. And that changes the role of farmers because they can use it right here. Moreover, most materials are usually tied to patents, technologies, and standards that can be controlled. With mycelium, everything is different because it cannot be created from scratch and assigned to one company. Because the mycelium already exists in nature and cannot be completely closed. This does not mean that individual processes cannot be protected, but the principle itself remains open, because it works in any environment where there is organic matter and suitable conditions. But it is control that often determines how material is distributed, because through it, the market and access can be controlled. Here, such control is weaker because the material does not require complex infrastructure or rare raw materials, and is less dependent on large manufacturers. And in the end, the point is not that the material is worse or not ready, but that it does not fit well into the system, where everything is based on control and consolidation of technology. At the same time, the effectiveness of mycelium has already been tested in practice, and by 2024, a house was built using it. It was made in Namibia, and this is important because it is not a laboratory, but a real project in conditions of limited resources. The base used local plants, including acacia, which is usually considered a weed. But here it became the raw material for the building blocks. The mycelium binds these materials together, creating durable panels and thermal insulation without synthetic additives. The house turned out to be resistant to fire, retained heat well, and was cheaper than conventional construction, largely because everything was done on site. This project shows that mycelium makes it possible to build where conventional solutions are too expensive or complex, and that this approach can be replicated. And that is why such projects almost never reach mass construction, because little is known about them outside the professional environment. In construction, new solutions do not spread on their own, because everyone relies on familiar practices and documents. And if a material is not included in the standards, it is as if it does not exist for the market, even if it is already used in practice. Nobody prohibits new approaches, but while they are not in the norms, they are simply not widely used. In the end, the point is not that there is no material, but that all this time it was outside the usual system. Mycelium has always been around. It's just that for a long time, no one looked at it as a material that could be worked with. And at some point it becomes clear that the point is no longer whether there are technologies, but whether you are ready to use something that does not fit into the usual system.